A massive army survived for 200 years in a hostile land far from home. Their secret weapon was not courage or faith alone, but a hidden network of supply chains that stretched across continents. You will understand exactly how the impossible became possible, revealing the true engine behind the Crusades. How did food and weapons travel thousands of miles from European farms to Middle Eastern battlefields? And who were the unseen masters coordinating this epic endeavor? What does it take to sustain a grand ambition when you are cut off from everything you know? The call to arms echoed across Europe, but faith could not carry an army across thousands of miles. The true foundation of this great endeavor was not just spiritual, but profoundly economic. It began with a simple, crushing reality. A single knight required a warhorse, armor, weapons, and a small retinue of support staff. Multiply that by thousands, and the sheer volume of material needed becomes staggering. Where did the wealth for such a venture come from? The answer lies in the very lands these nobles and knights were leaving behind. To fund their pilgrimage and military expedition, many sold or mortgaged their ancestral estates, their fields, and their forests. This created a sudden, massive transfer of wealth, liquidating fixed assets into movable treasure. Rivers of silver and gold began to flow from the European countryside, financing the purchase of supplies, the hiring of ships, and the paying of wages long before a single soldier set foot on a road to the east. This was the first crucial link in the chain, transforming the soil of France and England into the coins that would fuel a war in a distant desert. Without this economic engine, the grand armies would have dissolved before they even reached the Mediterranean coast. But money alone could not feed an army or forge a sword. This river of capital needed to be converted into tangible goods, and that conversion was a monumental task in itself. Think of the sheer variety required. Armies needed grain for bread, salt for preserving meat, and wine for safe drinking. They needed thousands of yards of cloth for tents and clothing, tons of iron for horseshoes and weapons, and vast quantities of wood for everything from siege engines to cooking fires. These materials were not simply sitting in a warehouse waiting to be collected. They had to be sourced from all over Europe. Iron might come from the mines of Germany, while high-quality wool for tunics was woven in the workshops of Flanders. The finest timber for building siege towers was harvested from the great forests of Burgundy. This was not a single purchase, but a continuous, rolling process of acquisition that transformed abstract wealth into the physical necessities of war. Local merchants and craftsmen became vital cogs in this machine, their workshops humming with activity funded by Crusader gold. A blacksmith in Marseille might not have cared about the theological debates happening in Rome, but he understood the value of a large order for 10,000 nails and 500 spearheads. This was the second, equally vital link in the chain, a continent-wide scramble to turn coin into cargo, preparing for a journey into the unknown. The lifeblood of any army is its daily bread. While knights and nobles carried the wealth of their lands in coin, that wealth was utterly useless without a constant, reliable supply of food. This need transformed the quiet, rural landscapes of Europe into a bustling agricultural engine dedicated to a war happening a world away. Vast tracts of farmland, from the rolling fields of France to the manors of England, were repurposed. Their primary mission was no longer just feeding local populations, but producing massive surpluses specifically for the Crusader armies. Monasteries, with their disciplined workforces and extensive lands, became powerhouses of production. Manorial estates intensified their farming, clearing new fields and planting more crops than ever before. The goal was to fill granaries to the brim with wheat, barley, and rye. This grain was then milled into flour and baked into hardtack, a durable biscuit that could survive months at sea. In slaughterhouses and smokehouses, animals were processed into barrels of salted beef and pork, preserved against the rot of a long journey. Wines, safer to drink than questionable water, were barreled by the thousands of gallons. This was not a haphazard effort. It required meticulous planning against the relentless turn of the seasons. Harvests had to be gathered and processed in time to meet the departure of spring and summer fleets from southern ports. A missed harvest could mean an army starving before it even saw its destination. The entire system was a monumental achievement in medieval logistics, proving that a conflict fought under a foreign sun was ultimately sustained by the familiar soil of home. But how did these mountains of food, these barrels of wine and salt meat, actually travel from the peaceful European countryside to the battlefields of the Levant? The journey from farm to fork involved a complex and often perilous web of land and water routes, a hidden network of arteries that kept the heart of the crusade beating. These rivers became the hidden highways of the crusade. The great waterways of Europe, like the Rhine, the Danube, and the Rhone, functioned as natural conveyor belts, carrying the immense weight of the war effort. Massive, flat-bottomed barges, heavily laden with barrels of grain and crates of weapons, would drift with the current or be painstakingly hauled upstream by teams of men and animals. This river network was the most efficient way to move such bulk over long distances, turning the continent's geography into a strategic advantage. But these waterways did not reach every farm or every workshop. This is where a second, more arduous network took over. A web of overland cart routes, often little more than dirt tracks, connected inland production centers to the river ports. Ox-drawn carts, creaking under their heavy loads, inched their way across the landscape. Their progress was agonizingly slow, vulnerable to every rut and every storm. A sudden downpour could turn a road into a quagmire, trapping wagons for days. And then there were the human dangers. Bandits knew these supply routes were rich with treasure, making every journey a gamble. To manage these risks, a relay system evolved. Supplies would not travel from source to sea in one continuous journey. Instead, they moved in stages, handed off from one local carting team to the next, moving from one way station to another. These way stations were vital oases, providing rest for exhausted drivers, fodder for the animals, and basic repairs for the battered carts. This entire system, a patchwork of river barges and overland trails, was a masterpiece of medieval coordination. It slowly, steadily funneled the scattered wealth of a continent toward a few key gathering points. The great port cities of the Mediterranean, like Marseille and Genoa, became the final repositories for this river of material. Here, on the bustling docks, the fruits of Europe's labor were finally consolidated, sorted, and counted. But this was only the beginning of their dangerous journey. The most perilous leg of the entire supply chain still lay ahead, across the open and unpredictable sea. These great ports were gateways to the most treacherous stage of the journey. The Mediterranean Sea stretched before the Crusaders as a vast and unpredictable aquatic highway. This was the domain of the great Italian maritime republics, cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Their wealth and power were not built on land but on their mastery of the sea. They specialized in constructing the colossal vessels that could bridge the continents, ships known as cogs and galleys. These were not simple boats but floating fortresses of logistics, engineered to carry hundreds of tons of precious cargo across thousands of miles of open water. The challenges they faced were immense. A single violent storm could send an entire season's worth of supplies and the men transporting them to the bottom of the sea. Pirates lurked in coves and narrow straits, always ready to pounce on a slow-moving, heavily laden merchant ship. To mitigate these dangers, the ships rarely traveled alone. They moved in protective convoys, with armed galleys serving as escorts to deter attacks. Navigation was a constant test of skill and courage. Without modern instruments, captains relied on the sun and stars for celestial navigation during the day and night, while also carefully tracking their progress against known coastal landmarks. Their destination was the string of Crusader-held ports like Acre and Jaffa, lifelines for the armies waiting ashore. But perhaps the most astonishing cargo was not grain or weapons, but the horses. Transporting warhorses was a logistical nightmare. These massive, skittish animals had to be loaded onto the ships using special ramps, and then housed in makeshift stalls below deck for weeks on end. They required special feeding mechanisms and constant care to prevent injury or sickness in the cramped, rolling conditions. The loss of a ship carrying horses was a catastrophic blow, as these animals were the tanks of their day, irreplaceable on the battlefield. The safe arrival of a fleet in an eastern harbor was a moment of profound relief and celebration. Yet, this monumental achievement was only the beginning of the final challenge. The mountains of supplies, now safely on land, had to be distributed across a harsh and unforgiving landscape, moving from the safety of the coast to the desperate armies inland. These city-states did not operate out of charity. Their fleets were the result of meticulous calculation and hard-nosed negotiation. The doges and councils of Venice and Genoa sat across the table from kings and bishops, hammering out contracts that would define the flow of the crusade. In exchange for their indispensable ships, they demanded and received extraordinary concessions. They secured exclusive rights to set up merchant quarters in key coastal cities like Tyre and Acre, entire districts where their own laws applied and their own merchants paid no taxes. They were given control over vital ports, turning them into fortified hubs that served their commercial interests as much as any military goal. This was a business arrangement on a continental scale. The merchant republics provided the logistical backbone, and in return, they carved out their own private empires within the Crusader states. Their merchant colonies were far more than just warehouses. They were the nervous system of the entire operation. Agents living in these outposts constantly monitored the situation on the ground. They sent detailed reports back to their home cities, noting when a particular fortress was running low on arrowheads or when a bad harvest had created a desperate need for grain. This flow of intelligence allowed the republics to fine-tune their supply chains with remarkable precision. A fleet would not set sail with a random assortment of goods. It was loaded with specific commodities that the agents knew would fetch the highest price or were most urgently needed for survival. This created a resilient, almost modern system, where supply was directly informed by real-time demand from the front lines. It was a public-private partnership where the driving force was not only faith but also profit. So what filled the vast holds of these Venetian cogs and Genoese galleys? The list of cargo reads like an inventory for an entire society on the move. Beyond the obvious grain and weapons, ships carried strange and vital supplies. There were barrels of nails in a dozen different sizes, from small tacks for chests to massive spikes for fortifications. They carried millstones, heavy discs of stone essential for grinding grain into flour, because you could not bake bread without a mill. They transported pre-cut timber, carefully shaped and numbered for quick assembly into siege towers and catapults upon arrival. The most challenging cargo was living. Flocks of sheep and herds of cattle were crammed onto special decks, their bleats and moos mixing with the shouts of sailors. but the most valuable and difficult passengers were the warhorses. These destroyers, the tanks of the medieval world, required custom-built stalls and special slings to keep them steady during storms. Their loss at sea was a financial and military catastrophe. Every item, from the smallest horseshoe nail to the largest siege engine beam, represented a single link in a chain of survival that stretched all the way back to a blacksmith's forge in Italy or a quarry in France. Every item loaded into a ship's hold was a calculated decision between survival and disaster. The most critical cargo was food, but not just any food. It had to withstand months at sea in damp, salty air, followed by more months in the scorching heat of a desert campaign. This ruled out fresh bread or vegetables. Instead, the staple was hardtack, a rock-solid biscuit baked until nearly all moisture was gone. Soldiers would often dunk it in wine or water just to make it edible. Alongside this came vast quantities of dried legumes like lentils and beans, which could be boiled into a nutritious stew, and barrels upon barrels of salt cod or salt pork. Salt was the unsung hero of the entire operation, a magical preservative that kept tons of protein from rotting. Without these durable, non-perishable foods, an army would starve long before it ever faced an enemy knight. But an army cannot fight on bread and salt pork alone. The military hardware was just as carefully selected. You would not waste precious space on finished swords or full-length spears. Instead, ships were packed with modular components. There were crates of iron spearheads to be fitted onto wooden shafts cut from local trees upon arrival. There were bundles of arrowheads by the tens of thousands, and sheets of raw iron for skilled blacksmiths to hammer into customized pieces of armor on demand. This was logistics in its purest form, shipping the essence of the weapons, not the bulky final products. Then came the living cargo, a logistical challenge of an entirely different magnitude. A knight's warhorse was a priceless asset, but it was also a 1,000-pound animal that needed constant care. Transporting them required specially designed ships with modified stalls and slings to keep the terrified animals from breaking their legs in rough seas. Each horse consumed huge amounts of fresh water and fodder during the voyage, meaning that a significant portion of the ship's space was dedicated not to the horse itself, but to the food the horse would eat. The same was true for oxen, the powerful beasts needed to haul siege engines and supply wagons once on land. Their massive consumption meant that every animal transported was a deliberate trade-off, sacrificing space for other supplies in exchange for mobile power on the battlefield. Even morale was a commodity that had to be shipped. While the common soldier subsisted on hardtack and bean stew, the nobility required comforts to maintain their leadership and cohesion. Barrels of wine were not a luxury but a necessity for the command structure, providing a safe drink and a tangible reminder of home. Rare spices from the East, sometimes even acquired on previous voyages, were also part of the cargo, used to make unfamiliar local food more palatable and to reinforce the social hierarchy that kept the army functioning. Loading all of this onto a rolling ship was a high-stakes puzzle. Quartermasters, the unsung geniuses of the operation, directed the careful placement of each item. Heavy barrels of water and wine were placed low in the hull to act as ballast, keeping the vessel stable. Crates of fragile arrowheads were stored in drier areas, away from the damp bilge water. Fodder for the animals had to be kept accessible for daily feeding, yet not block crucial pathways. A single mistake in this balancing act could capsize a ship or ruin an entire season's supply of food. The safe arrival of the fleet was a triumph, but it was not the end of the journey. The moment the first crate touched the dock, a new and equally complex phase began. the frantic and precise art of distribution to an army that was always desperate for what the ships brought. The true test of the entire supply chain began the moment cargo was unloaded onto the docks of Acre. A mountain of supplies in a port city was useless to an army besieging a fortress 50 miles inland. The coastal strongholds became the beating hearts of the operation, with their castles and fortified compounds housing a hidden world of storage. Within thick stone walls, deep underground silos were carved from the rock, keeping vast quantities of grain and olive oil safe from the scorching heat and from enemy raiding parties. These were not simple cellars but sophisticated climate-controlled spaces, designed to preserve the precious cargo for months or even years. The man in charge of this treasure was often a specially appointed official, a clerk or a trusted knight whose most powerful weapon was his ledger. He maintained meticulous inventories, knowing the exact count of every arrowhead, the weight of every barrel of salt pork, and the volume of grain in every silo. This was not mere bookkeeping, it was the key to survival. Based on these records, he allocated daily rations, ensuring a knight received more than a foot soldier, but also that no one, regardless of rank, could hoard more than their fair share. A portion of everything was always held back, a sacred reserve for the inevitable emergency, a siege that could last for a year or more. But how did these stockpiles reach the soldiers who needed them most, scattered across a rugged and hostile landscape? The distribution network was the final, fragile link in the chain. Packed trains of mules and camels, the only animals agile enough for the narrow mountain paths, were loaded with precisely measured loads. These convoys moved under heavy guard, a line of men and animals snaking through dusty valleys and over steep hills. Every journey was a gamble. The terrain was punishing, with trails that could collapse under a heavily laden animal. And then there was the ever-present threat of enemy cavalry who could descend from the hills without warning, aiming to capture the supplies or simply burn them where they stood. The safe arrival of a single mule train carrying sacks of flour and bundles of arrows could mean the difference between a garrison holding its position or being starved into surrender. This entire system, from the silent silo to the vulnerable pack animal, was a masterpiece of medieval administration and courage, proving that winning a war was as much about managing resources as it was about winning battles. Yet for all the engineering behind those shipments, the Crusaders could not live on hardtack and salt pork alone. The moment an army marched inland, away from the secure ports, it had to find a way to eat from the land itself. A sophisticated, two-pronged system emerged, blending imported staples with local procurement. One part of this system was economic. Crusader commanders became regular customers in the bustling markets of the Levant. Armenian, Syrian, and Jewish merchants, with their deep local knowledge and established trade networks, became indispensable. From them, the armies could purchase what their ships could not easily carry: fresh bread, fruit, vegetables, and leather for repairing saddles and armor. This was not just a convenience, it was a strategic calculation. Buying locally saved the immense cost and space of shipping such perishable goods across the sea. It also wove the Crusaders, however tenuously, into the regional economy, creating a fragile web of mutual interest between the newcomers and the established inhabitants. The other part of the system was military. When on the move, armies dispatched organized foraging parties. These were not random bands of looters, but disciplined units with a clear objective: to systematically gather crops from the fields, round up livestock from the hills, and locate fresh water sources. A commander might send out 100 men under a trusted knight to harvest a ripe grain field or to negotiate or demand the purchase of sheep from a local village. This practice provided the fresh supplies that kept an army healthy and mobile during a campaign. However, this constant taking from the land was a double-edged sword. While it kept the Crusaders fed, it could quickly drain an area of its resources and sour relations with the local population, whose survival depended on those very same fields and flocks. The success of this entire endeavor hinged on a delicate balance. Commanders had to be both generals and quartermasters, knowing when to rely on the supplies from their distant homelands and when to pivot, tapping into the immediate bounty of the land around them. This flexibility allowed them to respond to sudden opportunities or threats without being completely shackled to a supply line that stretched thousands of miles. But this reliance on the local environment introduced a new layer of vulnerability, one that their opponents learned to exploit with devastating effect. The Mediterranean could turn from a highway into a graveyard in a matter of hours. A sudden storm, the kind that could whip up without warning, was a commander's nightmare. A single tempest had the power to erase an entire fleet from the map, sending ships, their precious cargo, and all hands to the depths. The loss was more than just material. It was a strategic catastrophe that could cripple an army's campaign for an entire season. This constant threat of natural disaster forced planners to think in layers of redundancy. They never sent a single ship with a critical resource, instead dispersing vital supplies across multiple vessels in a convoy. They also had to contend with the land itself. A drought in the Levant could wither the grasslands, leaving no forage for the pack animals and warhorses that were the army's legs, paralyzing movement and forcing a search for alternate and often more dangerous routes. The very climate was an enemy, with the relentless heat spoiling food supplies that had survived the long sea voyage. Barrels of water could turn foul, and flour could become a breeding ground for weevils, turning sustenance into poison. Piracy was another ever-present danger, a business risk calculated into the cost of every voyage. Muslim corsairs operating from North African bases were a known threat, but sometimes the greatest danger came from closer to home. Rival Christian city-states competing for the same lucrative trade routes were not above seizing each other's ships under the flimsiest of pretexts. A Genoese captain might happily plunder a Venetian galley if he thought he could get away with it. This chaotic environment made armed escorts a non-negotiable expense. Fleets of merchant cogs would huddle together for protection, shepherded by swift, oar-powered galleys manned with crossbowmen and marines. When prevention failed, the final resort was negotiation, with city governments sometimes paying hefty ransoms to reclaim captured ships and their invaluable cargo. This threat did not end at the shoreline. Overland supply caravans snaking their way from the coast to inland castles were the favorite targets of Bedouin tribesmen. These highly mobile raiders knew the desert like the back of their hand, and they could descend from the dunes, strike a vulnerable point in the caravan, and vanish with their plunder before a relief force could be mustered. Their goal was not just loot, but to systematically choke the Crusader armies, cutting the fragile threads that connected them to the sea. Yet perhaps the most demoralizing enemy was an invisible one, the silent, creeping work of spoilage. Despite the best efforts at preservation, a significant portion of the food simply rotted away. Salted meat, if not perfectly cured and stored, could putrefy in the humid hold of a ship. Weevils and other pests would infest grain sacks, consuming from within what appeared to be a full supply. A shipment that looked ample on the docks could be revealed as a hollow shell upon inspection, its nutritional value devoured by unseen mouths. This constant degradation meant that quartermasters could never fully trust their own inventories. They had to assume that a portion of every delivery was already lost, forcing them to stockpile even greater surpluses to account for this inevitable waste. The consequences of this spoilage were dire, leading not just to hunger but to disease. Eating spoiled food weakened soldiers, making them susceptible to dysentery and other illnesses that could ravage a camp more effectively than any enemy cavalry. Overcoming these ceaseless logistical hurdles required a different kind of courage, one built not on the charge of a knight, but on the patient, clever mind of an administrator who planned for failure at every turn. The entire operation was a high-wire act, a testament to human ingenuity constantly battling against the indifferent forces of nature and the ruthless ambition of rivals. The real power behind those supply chains was not the cargo itself, but the flow of information that guided it. While a ship laden with grain might take months to arrive, a single piece of critical intelligence could cross the same distance in a fraction of the time, carried by specialized messengers on swift horses or aboard sleek, oar-powered galleys built for speed over cargo. These couriers were the nervous system of the entire operation, carrying tightly rolled letters between the command centers in Europe and the front lines in the Levant. A letter departing from the besieged city of Acre might detail a sudden shortage of crossbow bolts or warn of an enemy army gathering in the north. This information, racing back to Venice or Genoa, allowed the merchant lords to react with astonishing speed. They could halt the loading of a ship destined for one port and redirect it to another where the need was more desperate. To protect these vital messages, they often employed coded language, simple ciphers that would render a request for 500 swords or a report on a traitorous ally meaningless to any enemy agent who intercepted the courier. But there was an even faster network operating over shorter distances, one that moved through the air. Both Crusader and Muslim forces maintained sophisticated pigeon post systems. Key castles housed dovecotes, and birds trained to fly back to their home roost would be carried by field commanders on campaign. If a scout spotted an enemy force approaching, a scribbled note could be attached to a pigeon's leg, and within hours, a castle dozens of miles away would be raising its drawbridge and preparing for a siege, long before the enemy army even appeared on the horizon. This rapid flow of intelligence transformed the entire logistical effort from a blunt instrument into a precise scalpel. A quartermaster in Marseille, reading a 2-week-old report about a poor local harvest around Antioch, knew to prioritize shipments of flour over reinforcements of men. A ship captain meeting a fast galley at a coastal stop could receive new orders to sail to a different, more vulnerable port. This constant stream of updates allowed the entire sprawling network to breathe, to contract and expand in response to the ever-shifting realities of war. The movement of supplies was a physical reaction to the invisible and far quicker movement of information. It was a grand logistical chess game, and the player who mastered the flow of news held the power to checkmate his opponent without ever swinging a sword. A quartermaster's ledger was worth more than a dozen knights. This unassuming man, often a clerk or a minor noble with a head for numbers, held the life of the army in his ink-stained hands. His domain was the dimly lit storerooms of coastal castles, where he moved through a labyrinth of barrels and sacks, his stylus constantly scratching on a wax tablet. He knew that a misplaced decimal point could mean 100 men going hungry for a week. His calculations were a daily miracle of medieval administration, balancing the slow trickle of supplies from the sea against the relentless consumption of thousands. He decided who ate and how much, from the lord who required fine wine to maintain his authority to the lowly foot soldier whose strength depended on his daily loaf. This was not a job of glory, but one of immense, quiet responsibility. The entire military machine would have seized up within days without his meticulous, thankless work. Out on the open sea, another kind of specialist defied the elements. The sailors of the Italian republics were masters of a dangerous and unforgiving craft. They could read the weather in the subtle shifts of the wind and the color of the clouds. At night, they navigated by the fixed patterns of the stars, their knowledge passed down from father to son over generations. These men were not soldiers, but their courage was just as vital. They battled storms that could snap a mast like a twig and endured the constant threat of pirates. Their skill in handling the massive, cumbersome cogs in tight harbors was a form of high-stakes artistry. A single misjudgment could mean a ship and its priceless cargo dashed against the rocks. They lived in a world of salt, rope, and wood, their bodies hardened by a life of labor, and their specialized knowledge was the only thing that connected the farms of Europe to the battlefields of the Holy Land. Back on land, the army carried its own workshops within its ranks. A column on the march was accompanied by the constant sound of hammers on anvils. The mobile blacksmith was a figure of immense practical importance. His forge, a portable setup carried on a cart, was a hub of constant activity. He did not just shoe horses, though that alone was a monumental task. He repaired sword blades that had been notched in combat, fixed broken links of chainmail, and hammered out dents in helmets. His knowledge of metallurgy was entirely practical, learned through years of apprenticeship. He knew exactly how to heat and temper a piece of steel to make it both hard and flexible. Alongside him worked the leatherworkers, constantly stitching and repairing saddles, water skins, and armor straps that wore out under the harsh sun. These craftsmen formed a rolling infrastructure of repair, ensuring that the army's equipment did not simply disintegrate from the wear and tear of campaign life. Their work meant the difference between a fully armored knight and a vulnerable man on a lame horse. The coordination between these diverse experts was a masterpiece of medieval organization. A military commander gave the broad objective to besiege a castle or to march to a certain city, but it was the quartermaster, consulting with the ship captains and the master craftsmen, who determined the how. They spoke a common language of necessity and timing. The quartermaster knew that the blacksmith needed a fresh supply of iron from the next ship, and he would make sure it was on the manifest. The ship captain knew that a delay in unloading his cargo of fodder would mean the army's horses would starve, so he drove his crew relentlessly. This chain of command blended the absolute discipline of the military with the practical, problem-solving mindset of the merchant. A decision made in a command tent about a troop movement had to be instantly translated into a logistical requirement for food, water, and spare parts. There was no room for bureaucratic delay. The entire enterprise, from the quiet calculations in a storeroom to the skilled hands repairing a wagon wheel on a dusty trail, was a symphony of specialized labor. The resilience of the Crusader states for 2 centuries was not just a story of battles won, but a testament to the anonymous, dedicated specialists whose collective knowledge kept the machine of war functioning against impossible odds. A knight could not carry his castle's treasury in his saddlebags. The sheer physical danger of transporting chests of gold and silver across pirate-infested seas and bandit-ridden roads made the old way of doing things nearly impossible. Yet money had to move, and in vast quantities, to pay soldiers, purchase local supplies, and keep the entire war machine functioning. The solution was not a stronger chest or a larger guard, but a revolutionary idea, a piece of paper. This was the bill of exchange, a financial instrument that was as vital as any sword. A nobleman in France could deposit a sum of gold with a banking agent in Marseille. In return, he received a letter of credit, a formally written promise of payment. He could then travel to Acre, present that letter to the corresponding agent there, and receive the equivalent value in local silver coins, all without a single piece of gold ever leaving the safety of a vault. This system transformed wealth from a heavy, vulnerable physical object into a lightweight, secure piece of information. It was the lifeblood of the Crusader economy, allowing capital to flow as freely as water. But who were the architects of this financial revolution? They were the military orders, most famously the Knights Templar and the savvy merchant families of Italy. The Templars began as warrior monks, but their network of fortified preceptories stretching from London to Jerusalem evolved into something far more sophisticated, the world's first international banking group. A pilgrim or a crusader could deposit funds at a Templar commandery in Paris and withdraw them from the temple in Jerusalem, with the order's reputation for honesty and their military power guaranteeing the transaction. They did not just move money, they lent it. A baron needing to pay his troops during a long siege could take out a loan from the Templars, using his future plunder or his lands back home as collateral. This system of credit was the grease that kept the wheels of war turning when tax revenues or shipments of coin were delayed. The entire process relied on an intricate web of trust and verification. Banking agents used complex ciphers and secret seals to authenticate letters of credit, ensuring that a document presented in a dusty outpost was genuine. They maintained detailed ledgers that tracked every transaction across thousands of miles, creating a primitive but effective form of international accounting. This financial infrastructure did more than just serve the military. It sparked a vibrant, dynamic economy in the Crusader states themselves. A multitude of currencies circulated in the ports of the Levant: Byzantine gold bezants, Arab silver dirhams, and European pennies. Money changers, often operating under the strict regulation of the crown, established exchange rates, allowing a Venetian merchant to pay a Syrian porter with coins each recognized as valid. This bustling financial marketplace meant that a local farmer could sell his grain to the Crusader army and be paid in a currency he trusted, which he could then use to purchase goods from an Armenian merchant. The entire economy became a hybrid, a fusion of European and Eastern practices that was far more sophisticated than the simple extraction of resources. This was not merely a support system for a war. It was the dawn of a new era in global finance. The complex dance of letters of credit, international loans, and currency exchange that sustained the Crusader states for 200 years was a direct precursor to the systems that would later power the Renaissance and shape our modern world. The true strength of these orders lay in their seamless integration of faith and function. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller were not just warriors who prayed. They were global enterprises in monastic garb. Their networks of preceptories, fortified monasteries stretching from England to Jerusalem, formed the most secure and reliable logistical web in the medieval world. A Templar knight traveling from London to Acre did not have to brave the uncertainties of a common inn or worry about bandits stealing his coin purse. He moved from one Templar house to the next, each one a sanctuary offering a warm meal, a safe bed for the night, fresh horses from the order's own stables, and access to its well-stocked armory. These preceptories were the medieval equivalent of secure, all-in-one service stations, and they were operated with a discipline and efficiency that secular lords could only envy. Their command structure, answering directly to the Pope, allowed them to cut through the tangled feudal politics that often hampered royal supply efforts. A king of France might struggle to command the cooperation of a Duke of Burgundy, but a Templar sergeant in Paris could order supplies from a Templar preceptor in Marseille with the absolute certainty that the order would be obeyed. This vertical, transnational authority made them uniquely capable of managing a continent-spanning operation. The beating heart of this system was the flow of information and resources along these dedicated channels. A report of a Saracen army massing in the Jordan Valley, sent from the Templar fortress at Safed, could be relayed from preceptory to preceptory with astonishing speed, reaching the order's leadership in Europe weeks before a royal courier might arrive. This intelligence allowed them to pre-position supplies, reroute ships, and mobilize their knights with a strategic foresight that others lacked. Their operational independence was absolute. They built, owned, and sailed their own fleets from specially constructed ports like the one at Acre. Their ships were not subject to the whims of Venetian or Genoese merchants, giving them the freedom to move men and material when and where they were most needed, not when it was most profitable. In their vast warehouses, one would find not just the expected stocks of grain and weapons, but also the specialized goods that sustained their dual mission. The Hospitallers, true to their name, stored vast quantities of medical supplies, herbs, and linens, turning their strongholds into hospitals and centers of care for the sick and wounded, whether they were crusaders or, on occasion, even their foes. This logistical prowess was underwritten by a financial innovation that seems almost modern. The Templars perfected a system of credit that eliminated the need to transport bulky treasure. A pilgrim or a crusading knight could deposit his wealth at the temple in London, receiving a coded letter of credit. After his long journey, he could present this letter at the temple in Jerusalem and receive its value in local currency. This was in essence the first traveler's check. The system was built on the unshakable reputation of the Order for honesty and its formidable military power, which guaranteed the safety of the deposits. This service alone revolutionized the movement of capital, making wealth fluid and secure. It meant that the financial fuel for the Crusader states could flow as effortlessly as information, untethered from the physical limitations of chests of gold and silver. The Templars and Hospitallers proved that to sustain a holy war, you needed more than pious knights. You needed the cold, hard, brilliant efficiency of a global corporation. A siege was a brutal test of endurance for both attacker and defender. While the defenders waited behind their walls, the besieging army faced a different kind of battle entirely. One fought not against stone, but against time, hunger, and disease. To surround a castle was to create an instant, hungry town in the middle of hostile territory, a town that consumed everything and produced nothing. Every single item, from the daily bread for a lowly archer to the massive beams for a siege tower, had to be brought in from the outside, often through lands controlled by the enemy. The first and most immediate challenge was water. An army of thousands, along with its horses and oxen, required a staggering volume of fresh water every single day just to survive. If a river or spring was not conveniently located, water itself had to become a cargo, transported in massive leather bags and barrels on the same vulnerable supply routes that brought food. Without a secure and plentiful water source, a siege would collapse from thirst and dysentery within weeks. The supply lines leading to the siege camp became the army's literal lifeline, a narrow thread that enemy cavalry constantly sought to sever. Protecting these convoys required diverting hundreds of soldiers from the main force, creating a constant, draining war of patrols and ambushes in the surrounding countryside. The sheer volume of material needed was almost beyond comprehension. To break a castle's walls, you needed more than just courage, you needed specialized machinery. The most famous was the trebuchet, a colossal counterweight catapult capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. But how do you transport a machine that stands several stories tall? The answer was the siege train, a slow-moving caravan of dozens of carts that carried not the finished weapon, but its carefully designed components. The massive throwing arm, the heavy counterweight box, and the complex framework were all pre-fabricated in Europe, disassembled, and shipped across the sea. Upon arrival, these numbered pieces had to be hauled overland to the siege site, where teams of carpenters and engineers would work for days to reassemble them under constant arrow fire from the walls. The same was true for siege towers, multi-story wooden forts on wheels that were rolled up to the walls. Their construction on site consumed entire forests of local timber, requiring woodcutters to venture out under guard, stripping the landscape bare to feed the army's ambition. And then there was the ammunition. A single trebuchet could launch dozens of massive stones every hour. A siege lasting months would require thousands of them. If suitable rock was not available locally, stone balls had to be quarried and shipped in as ballast on ships, a use of space that meant sacrificing other vital supplies. The blacksmiths in the camp worked day and night, their forges glowing not to make swords but to produce the army's most expendable resource, arrows. A single volley from 1,000 archers could empty a supply wagon in minutes. The constant demand for arrowheads, shafts, and fletching was relentless, a manufacturing nightmare happening in a field workshop. Beyond the physical demands, commanders faced an invisible enemy, the slow erosion of morale and health. Feeding an army stale hardtack and salt pork for months on end led to scurvy and other deficiency diseases, weakening the men just when they needed to be strongest. Commanders who understood logistics would use their supply lines to bring in what little fresh fruit and vegetables they could, not as a luxury but as medicine. They also had to manage the camp itself, a sprawling, unsanitary tent city. The disposal of human waste and the butchery of animals had to be strictly managed downstream from the water supply to prevent epidemics that could kill more soldiers than any battle. A successful commander was therefore a master of many trades, a general, an engineer, a quartermaster, and a public health official all at once. The final assault on a castle's walls was merely the last act in a drama that had been won or lost weeks earlier in the quiet, relentless management of supply. Logistical survival demanded a constant, humbling education. The catastrophic early failures, where armies starved on the beaches for lack of a secure harbor, taught a brutal lesson that later commanders never forgot. The first and most critical innovation was the strategic shift to secure a friendly port as the absolute first objective of any campaign. A beachhead was not enough. You needed a fortified city with deep water docks, and you needed it immediately. This hard-won understanding transformed military planning, making the capture of a coastal stronghold like Acre or Tyre the central goal around which all other operations revolved. Without that gateway, the entire supply chain was just a theoretical exercise, but securing the port was only half the battle. The other great lesson was the necessity of local alliances. Crusader commanders learned to look beyond their own ranks and forge agreements with Armenian princes, Syrian Christian communities, and even some Muslim traders. These were not friendships born of faith, but partnerships born of necessity. A local Armenian guide knew the secret mountain passes where water could be found. A Syrian merchant could provide a steady stream of fresh fruit and vegetables from inland farms, preventing the scurvy that crippled armies living on salted supplies. This network of local support became a force multiplier, turning the hostile landscape from an impassable barrier into a navigable, if still dangerous, source of sustenance. On the move, innovation was a matter of daily survival. The mobile field forge became a standard feature of any campaigning army. This was not the permanent workshop of a castle, but a portable anvil, bellows, and a supply of charcoal carried on a sturdy cart. As the army marched, the blacksmiths would travel with it, and at each night's camp, their fires would be the first to light and the last to die. A knight whose sword was notched in a skirmish at dawn could have it repaired by dusk without the army ever halting its progress. This constant, rolling maintenance kept the fighting force sharp and functional, turning what would have been a catastrophic equipment failure into a minor, manageable repair. The journey of the supplies themselves also saw remarkable improvements. The early practice of stuffing grain into simple sacks was a recipe for disaster, as dampness and pests could ruin an entire shipment. Later campaigns developed far more durable packaging, weaving special tight baskets and coating them with tar or wax to create a waterproof seal. Barrels, once crude and prone to leaking, were crafted with greater skill. Their staves fitted so tightly that they could survive being submerged in seawater if a ship went down. Even the scheduling of fleets was refined. Instead of sending one massive, vulnerable armada each year, the Italians adopted a system of staggered departures. A ship would leave Genoa every few weeks, creating a continuous trickle of supplies that smoothed out the feast or famine cycle. If one ship was lost to a storm, another was already on the way, ensuring that a single disaster did not mean total collapse. Perhaps the most telling sign of their adaptability was their willingness to learn from their enemies. The Crusaders arrived relying on the ox cart and the horse, but they soon recognized the supreme efficiency of the camel for desert transport. They began to hire Bedouin guides and purchase camels in large numbers, creating their own caravans that could cross arid regions that would have starved their European animals. A camel could carry heavier loads, travel longer without water, and traverse soft sand that would swallow a wheeled cart. This was not a minor change, it was a fundamental re-engineering of their land-based logistics, adopting the best technology the region had to offer. They also looked to the sophisticated systems of the Byzantine Empire, their sometimes allies. From them, they learned advanced techniques for granary management, building stone silos that were cool, dry, and protected from vermin. They adopted Byzantine methods for recording inventories and tracking the rotation of stock, ensuring that older supplies were used first. This pragmatic embrace of foreign knowledge, whether from friend or foe, was the secret to their longevity. The Crusader states did not survive for 2 centuries because they were the strongest warriors, but because they became the most agile logisticians, constantly learning, adapting, and weaving a supply network that was as resilient as it was vast. How did this entire sprawling operation, this constant flow of men and material, finally come to an end? The answer lies not in a single lost battle, but in the slow, inexorable collapse of the very systems that had sustained them for so long. The Mediterranean itself imposed a brutal calendar on the entire war effort. The sea, a vital highway for half the year, transformed into an impassable barrier from November through March, when fierce storms made sailing a suicidal gamble. This simple, unchangeable fact of nature created an annual rhythm of feast and famine for the Crusader states. Every shipment, every soldier, every warhorse had to traverse that narrow window of opportunity between the calm of April and the rising gales of October. A commander who missed the last fleet of the season knew that no help, no supplies, and no reinforcements would arrive for 6 long months. This forced a strategic pause, a hibernation where armies retreated to their strongest fortresses to wait out the winter, surviving on the stockpiles they had desperately built up during the shipping season. The success of those stockpiles, in turn, depended on the agricultural heartbeat of Europe. A fleet could not set sail until the harvest was in. The wheat from the fields of France, the barley from England, all had to be reaped, threshed, milled, and baked into hardtack. A late or poor harvest in Europe did not just mean higher prices back home. It meant empty silos in Acre the following spring. The entire transcontinental effort was synchronized to this slow, plodding dance of the seasons. Commanders planning a summer campaign in the Holy Land were, in reality, looking at a calendar from the previous autumn, their fate tied to the success of a harvest happening a world away. But the local environment presented its own set of constraints. The Crusaders also had to learn the agricultural rhythms of the Levant. A wise commander knew he could not launch a major campaign during the height of the dry summer, when forage for his thousands of horses would be brittle and brown, and water sources would have shriveled to muddy holes. Instead, he would time his movements for the spring, when the land was green and could support his animals, or just after the autumn rains, when the earth was soft enough for siege works, and the air was cool enough for his men to labor in heavy armor. This intricate understanding of two separate agricultural calendars, one in Europe and one in the Middle East, was a required skill for any leader who hoped to succeed. The Crusader states were not just fighting armies, they were negotiating with the very climate, their grand strategies bending to the will of the harvest moon and the shifting winds. Victory often went not to the most pious army, but to the one whose commander could best read the natural world and plan his campaigns within its unyielding constraints. Silver from Europe's mortgaged estates did more than just buy supplies, it reshaped entire economies. Back in Venice and Genoa, the shipyards never slept. The constant, massive demand for new cogs and galleys created a boom that employed thousands, from the lumberjacks felling trees in the Alps to the caulkers sealing hulls with tar on the docks. This was not a temporary spike, it was a sustained industrial revolution on a medieval scale. The same dynamism echoed in the metalworking towns of Germany and the textile workshops of Flanders. Armorers and weavers found themselves with more orders than they could fill, their skills now valued in a global marketplace they had never seen. But this flood of Crusader wealth had a darker side. All that silver competing for a limited supply of goods, especially food, sent prices soaring across Europe. A peasant who had never heard of Jerusalem felt the Crusades' impact every time he went to market and found that his coins bought less bread than they had the year before. The very success of the funding effort created a hidden tax of inflation that strained the poor. In the Levant, the effect was even more profound. The Crusader ports became humming centers of a new hybrid economy. European silver coins mingled with Arab gold and Byzantine copper in the marketplace, and money changers did a brisk business converting it all. Local Syrian farmers learned to grow crops not just for their village, but for the massive, permanent army now garrisoned in their midst. Armenian merchants became the crucial middlemen, connecting inland trade routes to the insatiable demand of the coastal cities. This was not a simple colonial extraction, it was the birth of a complex, interdependent economy. A Frankish knight might eat bread made from Syrian wheat, served on a plate by a local craftsman, and paid for with silver that had once been a field in France. This fusion outlasted the Crusader kingdoms themselves, weaving the Levant more tightly into the fabric of Mediterranean trade for centuries to come. Yet this integration came with a heavy cost. The relentless demand for resources to feed and build the war machine could strip a landscape bare. Forests were felled for siege engines and fortifications, leaving hillsides vulnerable to erosion. Local flocks were depleted to feed the armies, and the constant pressure of foraging could turn fertile areas into zones of scarcity for the people who had lived there for generations. The economic legacy of the Crusader supply chains is a story of two faces, one of vibrant, unprecedented growth, and the other of a deep, enduring strain on the people and the land that bore its weight. Richard the Lionheart understood that a king's true power was measured not by the size of his army, but by the reach of his supply lines. The Third Crusade stands as a masterclass in this logistical art, a campaign where foresight and planning proved as decisive as any cavalry charge. Upon his arrival in the Holy Land, Richard faced a formidable adversary in Saladin and a landscape drained of resources by years of war. He recognized that marching his forces down the coast, exposed and vulnerable, would be a recipe for disaster. His solution was a radical fusion of land and sea power. The English fleet, a mix of his own ships and vessels from the Italian maritime republics, did not simply deliver his army and depart. Instead, it became a floating warehouse sailing parallel to the army's march. Each day, soldiers knew that just over the horizon, a mobile depot carried their food, their spare weapons, and their means of survival. This constant, visible assurance allowed Richard to push his men harder and faster, maintaining a relentless pressure that Saladin's forces, however numerous, struggled to counter. How did he secure such a reliable lifeline? The answer lay in a bold, preemptive strike. Before even reaching the mainland, Richard seized the wealthy island of Cyprus. This was not an act of random conquest, but a calculated logistical masterstroke. Cyprus was more than just an island. It was a self-sufficient agricultural powerhouse. Its fertile plains provided grain, its vineyards produced wine, and its forests offered timber. Most importantly, it possessed deep, secure harbors, safe from the storms and raids that plagued the coast. By controlling Cyprus, Richard created his own private supply base, a giant, unsinkable aircraft carrier positioned just off the enemy coast. He no longer had to beg for space in the crowded, politically fraught ports of the Levant. He owned his own gateway, and from it, a steady stream of fresh provisions and reinforcements could flow directly to his army, untouched by the uncertainties of the mainland. This level of coordination required a new kind of command structure. Richard's quartermasters and ship captains were in constant communication, using fast galleys to relay messages between the marching column and the offshore fleet. If the army's scouts reported a shortage of fresh water ahead, a ship could be dispatched to a predetermined coastal point to meet them with full casks. If a siege was imminent, the fleet could pre-position the massive components of trebuchets and siege towers, saving the army the back-breaking work of hauling them overland. This seamless integration meant that Richard's army, though often outnumbered, moved with a confidence and speed that baffled its opponents. They were not a wandering horde, but a precision instrument, its cutting edge honed by an invisible, unbreakable chain of supply. The campaign proved that in the harsh arithmetic of war, a well-fed soldier with a clear line of retreat was worth 3 hungry, desperate men. Superior logistics did not just support the army, it became the very weapon that brought a legendary commander to the brink of reclaiming Jerusalem. Yet for all its engineering marvels, this vast network rested on a handful of fragile points. The entire system depended on a few crucial coastal ports, with Acre standing as the most vital of them all. Its deep harbor and massive fortifications made it the primary gateway, the central hub through which nearly all supplies and reinforcements flowed. When Acre finally fell in 1291 after a brutal siege, it was not merely the loss of a city. It was a catastrophic severing of the main artery. The collapse of this single node effectively strangled the remaining Crusader states, proving that their survival was tethered to the security of a few miles of coastline. But external threats were only part of the danger. The Crusaders were often their own worst enemies. Rivalries between noble houses, between the military orders, and between the Italian merchant republics frequently boiled over into open conflict. In one infamous incident, the Genoese and Venetian quarters within Acre itself became a war zone, with rival factions fighting in the streets and setting fire to each other's warehouses, destroying precious supplies needed to fight their common enemy. This internal squabbling sometimes escalated into outright sabotage, where a faction would hoard grain or weapons to gain leverage over their rivals, starving frontline garrisons to feed a political feud. Corruption was another silent killer. A dishonest quartermaster tasked with distributing food, could create artificial shortages by secretly selling army rations on the black market. A castle commander might report a need for more men and arrows, not because he was facing a threat, but to inflate the value of his command and the resources he controlled. These acts of graft did more than steal treasure. They eroded the trust that held the entire logistical machine together, leaving soldiers to wonder if their hunger was due to enemy action or the greed of their own leaders. And then there was the inherent peril of distance itself. The supply lines stretched over thousands of miles of unpredictable sea and land. A single broken link anywhere along that chain could trigger a collapse. A drought in Sicily one year meant no surplus grain to send. A naval battle lost to an Egyptian fleet the next season meant no ships got through at all. A bandit chieftain gaining control of a mountain pass could halt the pack trains for weeks. These disruptions had a cascading effect. A delay in the spring fleet meant a summer campaign had to be cancelled. A cancelled campaign gave the enemy time to regroup and strengthen their own positions. This was the precarious reality of the Crusader enterprise, a high-wire act where balance was maintained only through constant effort and a great deal of luck, a testament to what could be achieved and a warning of how easily it could all fall apart. The sprawling networks that kept Crusader armies alive did not vanish when their last strongholds fell. Instead, these logistical blueprints were carefully studied and adapted, becoming the foundation for a new age of European expansion. When Spain and Portugal launched their voyages of discovery, they were applying Crusader logic to a global scale. They understood that a fortified coastal enclave, like the Crusader ports of Acre and Tyre, was the key to projecting power across an ocean. Their settlements in the Americas and Asia were not just colonies, they were strategic supply depots, nodes in a chain that stretched back to Lisbon and Seville. The concept of the protected naval convoy, perfected by the Italian merchant republics to guard against pirates, became the standard for the Spanish treasure fleets that carried silver from Potosi to Cadiz. This was not a coincidence, it was a direct inheritance. The military orders themselves evolved, with the Knights of Malta taking over the Hospitaller role, using their island base to control Mediterranean shipping lanes for centuries. The logistical principles of secure bases, redundant routes, and long-range naval support were the true spoils of the Crusades, tools that would later build empires. These medieval innovations found their ultimate expression in the mechanized warfare of the 20th century. The D-Day landings in Normandy were a staggering feat of modern logistics, but their underlying principle would have been familiar to a Templar quartermaster. Just as Richard the Lionheart's fleet sailed alongside his marching army, the Allied forces established artificial harbors to offload thousands of tons of supplies directly onto the beaches of France, creating their own secure gateway. The massive Allied convoys crossing the Atlantic, shepherded by destroyers to fend off German U-boats, were the direct descendants of the Genoese convoys guarded by war galleys. The strategic bombing of enemy factories and rail lines was a brutal extension of the medieval tactic of raiding supply caravans, an attempt to sever the enemy's logistical spine. In both eras, victory depended not on who had the bravest soldiers, but on who could most effectively manage the flow of fuel, food, and ammunition across impossible distances. Today, the ghost of the Crusader supply chain lives on in the globalized economy. The complex journey of a smartphone component from a factory in East Asia to a store in Europe is governed by the same principles of redundancy and communication that kept a Crusader castle stocked. Modern corporations, like medieval quartermasters, rely on multiple suppliers and transportation routes to avoid a single point of failure. A lesson hard learned when a single storm could sink an entire season's provisions. The real-time tracking of container ships is the modern equivalent of the pigeon post and fast couriers, providing the constant stream of data needed to reroute cargo around a port strike or a natural disaster. The Crusaders understood that a supply line is a living system and its greatest enemy is rigidity. Their need to adapt, to hire local guides, to shift from ox carts to camels, and to forge local alliances speaks directly to our own world of unpredictable disruptions. The fragile network that sustained an army in the Levant set a precedent that now connects our entire planet, reminding us that the movement of resources has always been the ultimate strategic game. Hollywood would have you believe Crusader armies survived by looting their way across the desert. The truth is far more interesting. Plunder was always a gamble, a desperate measure that could just as easily lead an army into an ambush as it could fill its bellies. A commander who relied on theft was a commander who had already lost control of his campaign. The real story was one of meticulous planning woven together with sharp, opportunistic adaptation. Think of a Crusader column on the march. Its daily bread did not magically appear from pillaged villages. It came from a carefully managed system where organized foraging parties, operating under strict orders, would harvest ripe grain fields or negotiate with local village headmen for their flocks. This was not random destruction, it was a calculated acquisition. They paid for what they took, often with the same silver that had been minted from European estates. This created a fragile but crucial economic interdependence. The real secret weapon was not the sword, but the market. In the bustling souks of cities like Acre, Frankish soldiers rubbed shoulders with Armenian merchants and Syrian farmers. They bought fresh figs, olives, and leather goods, injecting European silver into a vibrant local economy. This was not a one-way street of exploitation. Local producers adapted to this new demand, growing specific crops and supplying services that kept the Crusader machine functioning. The entire operation depended on indigenous knowledge. A Crusader quartermaster from France might know how to store grain for a Normandy winter, but he had no idea how to find water in the Judean desert. For that, he relied on Bedouin guides or Syrian Christians who knew the location of every hidden well and seasonal spring. The ships that supplied them were Italian, but the camels that carried the cargo inland were purchased and handled by local drovers whose families had crossed these sands for generations. This collaborative reality shatters the simplistic myth of a constant holy war between two monolithic blocks. The daily business of survival demanded cooperation, creating a complex middle ground where trade and necessity often trumped ideology. When we peel back the layer of battlefield heroics, we find the true engine of the Crusader states, a hybrid system built on a foundation of European capital, maritime power, and most essentially the deep, irreplaceable knowledge of the land and its people. The sprawling supply chains of the Crusades stand as a monumental achievement in medieval organization. They wove together distant finance and local agriculture, perilous navigation and bustling markets into a single, resilient lifeline that sustained grand ambitions across continents. This hidden network proved time and again that victory in a distant land depended as much on the steady supply of bread and barrels as it did on the fleeting courage of blades. From the mortgaged fields of France to the fortified ports of Italy and the besieged castles of the Holy Land, every link in this chain was a testament to human ingenuity. It was a system built not on mythic heroism, but on the quiet, relentless work of quartermasters, sailors, and merchants whose ledgers and navigational charts were as vital as any sword. The true legacy of these efforts is not just written in the stones of forgotten castles, but in the very blueprint of our modern world. As you reflect on this journey, consider the unseen systems that power your own life. The internet that delivers this story, the global trade that stocks your local market, these are the direct descendants of that medieval logistical genius. They are the hidden engines that shape our reality, just as surely as the supply lines of old shaped the fate of empires. If uncovering these forgotten foundations of history intrigues you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the past's most fascinating mechanics. And we would love to hear from you. Which logistical marvel from history do you find most impressive? Share your thoughts in the comments below.